Check your biases. Check your bias. Check your biases. Teachers should check their biases in students. That does not insulate or protect our students from the biases of others or from the biases of systems. We don't even know why we tell people to, learn standard English. We're consenting to the master narrative. We're consenting to the status quo. But beyond that, we're also reinforcing narratives of white supremacy. We're also reinforcing narratives of white supremacy, narratives of white supremacy, narratives.
If you're wondering who that guy is at the beginning of this video, we'll come back to him in a few minutes. First, I want to remind you of my previous video, video number 5. It's called Moment of Reflection on Equity. And in this video, I show you a clip of the New York State Education Department's Board of Regents meeting, where at the very beginning of the meeting, the Board of Regents literally hold a moment of reflection on equity. And they do this just before they have a group of panelists come in and introduce the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that video yet, go ahead and watch it when you get a chance. But I'm going to just show you a few seconds of that now, just so you get a chance to see what it looks like.
I think we're going to ask you for a moment of reflection. So please stand.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. New Year. So much of the work we have been doing this past year has been under the umbrella of a single word, and that word is equity. Although it has many formal definitions, simply put, equity means being fair and it means being inclusive.
This is the New York Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. The one on the left-hand side is the one when it was in draft form. The one on the right side is its finalized version. At the end of my last video, I showed you how to access this document. You can go ahead and Google New York Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. Click on the link. It'll bring you to the New York State Education Department's website, and then that'll have the link there for the document. You should get familiar with this document. You should read through it and get an idea and an understanding of what it says. I would suggest that you start at the end, actually, with the glossary of terms. That will give you an idea of the worldview of the people that wrote this document. Right after the Board of Regents held their moment of reflection on equity at the beginning of their January 2019 meeting, they received a presentation on the New York Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework.
Chancellor, thank you. We're very excited about this presentation this morning. It is, many of you are aware, you appointed individuals that are joining, several are with us today, to be on this panel and to work with us on culturally responsive sustaining education.
Districts. And we also want David to talk a little bit about, so David prepared a document for us that was kind of the basis of all this work. So we're really excited about that. So I'm going to move over and let the panel do its thing. Okay, David.
Remember that guy at the beginning of this video? His name is David Kirkland, and is the leading author of the New York Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. And he's about to sit down in front of the New York State Education Department's Board of Regents and present this framework to them. David Kirkland is the Executive Director of NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. He's the Associate Professor of English and Urban Education. Dr. David E. Kirkland is the Executive Director of the NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. He has also been described as an activist and educator, cultural critic and author, a leading national scholar and advocate for educational justice. Dr. Kirkland's transdisciplinary scholarship explores a variety of equity-related topics: school climate and discipline, school integration and choice, culture and education, vulnerable learners, and intersections among race, gender, and education. With many groundbreaking publications to his credit, he has analyzed the cultures, languages, and texts of urban youth using quantitative, critical literacy, ethnographic, and sociolinguistic research methods to answer complex questions at the center of equity and social justice in education.
Let me first thank each of you for your time. As some of you know, we at NYU Metro Center have been a leading voice pioneering culturally responsive sustaining education throughout New York State. In New York City, this work has taken bold shape. We have joined with Chancellor Carranza, an assembly of equity allies such as the Coalition for Education Justice, a team of committed educators, parents, students, and community members to transform schools through CRSE. Last year, New York Metro Center and our allies played a pivotal role in New York City Mayor's announcement to take CRE, culturally responsive education, to scale. The city has invested $21 million to train all members of the DOE. Of course, this work has been happening across New York State for some time, although in pockets and without serious alignment or scale. Culturally responsive sustaining education is meant for alignment and scale. So I started to study hip hop. I started to study hip hop and literacy education, watching how young men wrote on napkins the types of lyrics that we wanted to write, we wanted them to turn into term papers. To improve outcomes, we must consult culture as we consider how and what to teach, how education is organized, who gets to participate, and on what terms. So what does it take to support literacy learning among vulnerable students? This is what the research told me. This is what the information that I gave this teacher said, right? The research says, check your biases. The research says, raise high expectations. The research says, teach hip hop because hip hop is meaningful to my students. Instead of resigning ourselves to the incomplete narrative that we are hostage to the status quo, the next part, the consequences, whereby we consent to multiple forms of oppression. We're consenting to the master narrative. We're consenting to the status quo. But beyond that, we're also reinforcing narratives of white supremacy. But beyond that, we're also reinforcing narratives of white supremacy, narratives of anti-black, anti-brown racism, unchecked within the work that we do. And this leads to multiple forms of oppression. This is the basic premise of the framework, that we can actually transform education. Like we got this standard English thing. Those of you who study language, we don't even know why we tell people to, learn standard English. The framework sees inequities in education as structural consequences of long, deep, and complex histories. It's about this. What does it mean to learn to write? What does it mean to language? What does it mean to read, do math, do history, do science, when you come from a place like that? When you got lead dripping through your pipes. What does that mean? What does it mean when, you are enduring structural violence as part of your schooling experience? What if in Germany we had incarceration rates where Jewish people were 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than Germans? How would that make us feel? That in the United States, we have literacy rates that map on to, out of school, cycles. We call it pipeline stuff, right? School to prison pipeline. Some people talk about the school to cemetery pipeline. When we got these rates that map on to these other things. It suggests that we can improve education not by ignoring or running from those histories, but by claiming them, confronting them, and courageously dealing with them. to examine questions like, how do we examine structural biases aimed at students by individuals other than their single teacher? Right, when we got research findings that suggest that teachers should check their biases in students, that does not insulate or protect our students from the biases of others, or from the biases of systems, or from the biases of structures that they endure every day. Right? It goes beyond talking about telling teachers to be non-racist, to helping teachers become anti-racist. And the two aren't the same. At the core of the framework are foundations set on bedrock principles: socio-political consciousness and socio-cultural responsiveness. And what do I mean by the politics of culture? We know that culture can be used and is used as a socio-political currency for the exchange of values, dispositions, and beliefs. But now I'm thinking about teaching and teacher education work as care workers. Care work says, or at least it raises questions about, how do we move beyond asking teachers to check their biases to helping them to disrupt all bias? How do we move beyond only asking teachers to raise high expectations to helping them to do what's necessary to help our students reach high expectations? It says, how do we move beyond asking teachers to just teach what our students find meaningful to asking them to also learn from what our students find meaningful? It's about, moving beyond asking our teachers to get to know their students, to having our teachers think about how they might allow their students to know them. Because care work is about achieving justice in education. These principles are visioned as keys to unlocking the doors of opportunity in ways that emit the light of change and bend old histories and the slant of the moral universe and closer to justice.
And look at how we make students look at social justice as a curriculum piece, but also as being their own advocates for agency of change.
And so whether those school communities referred to this work as social justice education, culturally relevant education, or they use some other phrasing,
I want to be very clear that this is not about David Kirkland. He happens to be the main author of New York's Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework, and also one of the leading forces behind the movement in New York. But his worldview and his ideas about education are shared by a lot of other activist educators who have a lot of influence over education policy. So this is much bigger than David Kirkland and much bigger than one person. This is a movement that's been growing in education throughout the country. An article came out recently that was written by two of the early writers of New York's Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. They helped David Kirkland write the document. The article is called Prioritizing Mindsets: What New York State's Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework Gets Right. Now remember, this article was written by the writers of the framework. The article was written by Pamela DeAndrea Martinez and Evan M. Johnston. I'm not going to go ahead and read the entire article here, but I'm going to leave the link in the description below. I highly suggest that you read this entire article. It gives great insight into the worldview and the ideas about education that are in the New York Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. I'm just going to read one paragraph from the article just so you have an idea of what's in it. CRSE does not buy into gaps because it disrupts the premise of achievement, exchanging deficit views of students with placing students as both the starting and ending places of learning. When inequities arise, CRSE names them what they are: racism, cis-heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism, white supremacy, and ableism, viewing the challenges we face in education as historical as opposed to individual. Like I said, I highly recommend that you read this entire article yourself so you can see what's in it. You can also go to Benjamin Boyce's YouTube channel. He recently made a video where he discusses this entire article, and so you can learn a lot more information that way as well. This is the New York State Education Department's Board of Regents Chancellor, Betty Rosa. Here she describes her association with David Kirkland, NYU Metro Center, and the New York Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework Committee.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. Before we move on, I know only because I am working very closely with Joe Rogers and with David Kirkland as part of a member on this CRS with Metro, and I'm on that committee. So can you talk?
We started the morning with some very powerful statements from Regent Sia on equity, and we proceeded to look at an equity agenda that has tremendous implications for all the children in New York State. I now am going to present to you for your consideration an equity resolution that we think is incredibly important. This resolution that we are presenting to the board this morning reaffirms our commitment as a board to continuing our efforts to ensure that all students have equitable access to learning opportunities in safe and supportive school environments, free from discrimination, harassment, and bias, including reducing dependence on exclusionary school discipline and increasing equity in education for all of our students. So I hereby submit that resolution for the board.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. To echo my colleague's sentiment, we felt it was important to respond to this guidance. And so with that, with the Chancellor's indulgence, I'm just going to read it as quickly as I can into the record so that we have it. And whereas, with the support of the legislature and the governor at the request of the Board of Regents, the New York State Education Department has established a Safe and Supportive Schools program and technical assistance center for schools determined to be in need of support to create positive school climates where every child feels safe and supportive and is treated with dignity and respect through the implementation of positive school climate frameworks, including social and emotional learning, restorative practices, and trauma-sensitive schools. Now, therefore, be it hereby resolved that the Board of Regents reaffirms its commitment to continuing its efforts to ensure that all students have equitable access to learning opportunities in safe and supportive school environments, free from discrimination, harassment, and bias, including reducing dependence on exclusionary school discipline and increasing equity in education for all students. Thank you, Madam Chancellor.
Motion by?
I have made the motion.
I'd like a second. Second. All in favor? Okay. Thank you.
I don't get the second.
Motion is unanimous.
Yes.
Great job. That was.
Says, check your biases. Check your bias. Check your biases. Teachers should check their biases in students. That does not insulate or protect our students from the biases of others or from the biases of systems. We don't even know why we tell people to, learn standard English. We're consenting to the master narrative. We're consenting to the status quo. But beyond that, we're also reinforcing narratives of white supremacy. We're also reinforcing narratives of white supremacy, narratives of white supremacy, narratives.